I had spent weeks telling myself this day would be worth all the scars my marriage had left me with. My son's wedding was supposed to be my fresh start, a moment of pride that would wash away years of quiet bitterness. The church was decorated in gold and ivory, flowers blooming down the aisle, cameras flashing, guests laughing, all of them expecting to see a family united. On the surface, we were exactly that. The Wards, respectable, polished, unbreakable. But I knew better. My husband, Harlan, had made sure the cracks never showed to the outside world. Only to me. I held my head high as Quentin stood at the altar. My boy, my firstborn, my only son, looked sharp in his tuxedo, smiling that smile he inherited from his father. Everyone said he looked like Harlan, and they were right. What they didn't see was how much of his father's mannerisms, his ambition, even his coldness he had taken on as well. Still, I wanted to believe in him. I wanted to believe that today was about love, not legacy, not power, not control. Then my phone buzzed. Just one vibration, soft against the satin of my dress. I slipped it from my clutch, meaning to ignore it, but my eyes caught on the words glowing across the screen. Leave quietly. Don't tell your son or husband. That was it. No name, no explanation. Just those 9 words that sent a chill racing through me. My first instinct was to glance at Harlan, seated just a few rows ahead, smiling, shaking hands with Maricella's parents as though nothing could ever touch him. My second instinct was to lean toward the person sitting beside me, to ask if they had seen who sent it. But something inside me, some instinct honed by years of surviving this marriage, told me to obey. I rose slowly, excusing myself with the smallest whisper about needing the restroom. Nobody questioned me. After all, I was just the mother of the groom, and the ceremony hadn't officially started. Still, I could feel the weight of my steps as I moved toward the side exit, each stride echoing louder than it should. Outside, the air hit me like a slap, cool, sharp, and far too quiet compared to the music and chatter inside. I stood on the steps, clutching my phone, staring at the text again, as if it might rearrange itself into something more rational. Who would send me that? Why now, of all times? I should have turned back. I should have ignored it, laughed it off, told myself I was being paranoid. But something, whether fear, curiosity, or the voice of survival, kept me moving forward. I walked farther from the hall, heels clicking against the pavement, until I reached the edge of the parking lot. That was when I noticed the first oddity, a black sedan I didn't recognize parked away from the rest, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see a shadow inside. I froze, and for a moment I felt foolish. Maybe this was nothing. Maybe the text was just some cruel prank. But as I turned my head, I caught sight of 2 men leaning against the far fence line, dressed in dark suits. They weren't laughing, weren't smoking, weren't mingling like the other guests outside. They were just watching. And though their eyes weren't on me, I knew they were part of whatever this was. I gripped my phone tighter. I wanted to run back inside, to find Quentin, to cling to him like I did when he was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. But I couldn't, not when the warning was so clear, not when every instinct in my body screamed that walking back through those doors meant walking straight into something I wasn't meant to see. I stood there, caught between the life I had known and the danger of what was unfolding, realizing too late that my leaving quietly hadn't been about protecting me at all. It had been about removing me from the scene. about sparing me from a humiliation I hadn't even begun to imagine. And that was the first step in unraveling everything I thought I knew about my husband, my son, and the life they had been building without me. I was about to head back inside when voices drifted around the corner. Two men, not guests I recognized, stood smoking in the shadows, their words hushed but sharp enough to carry. She signed off on it. I thought she was going to fight. She doesn't even know what's coming. That old signature trick worked better than I expected. They both chuckled, the sound grating in my ears. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart racing. My name wasn't spoken, but I felt it like they were talking about me, without saying it outright. My palms grew damp as their words settled into my bones. The old signature trick. I thought of the countless documents Harlan had shoved in front of me over the years, papers I was told to sign quickly without reading, insurance renewals, mortgage adjustments, amendments to things I never fully understood. He always made me feel foolish for asking questions. Don't worry about it, Evelina. He'd say, I'll handle it. But now, hearing strangers laugh about forged signatures at my son's wedding, the puzzle pieces began to rattle into place. I pulled back before they could spot me, circling around to the far side of the lot where cars were lined up like silent witnesses. My breath came uneven as I tried to steady myself. Could it be possible that they had faked my approval on something important, that I wasn't just being erased emotionally, but legally? As if to confirm my suspicion, I caught sight of a lady, Denise, I thought her name was, hurrying toward the hall with a folder clutched to her chest. She wasn't dressed like the other guests. Her shoes were scuffed, her dress too plain. She looked like she didn't belong, and yet she moved with purpose, ducking her head as if she didn't want to be noticed. The folder slipped from her hands as she tugged at the heavy door. Papers fluttered out across the pavement. I bent quickly to help her, and for one brief second, my eyes caught on a letterhead I knew too well, Ellis and Ward Holdings. My husband's business. My family name. Before I could take in more, Denise snatched the papers up, her hands trembling, and muttered a hurried thank you before disappearing inside. I stood rooted to the ground. The words on that page seared into my memory, transfer of beneficial interest. The seed of betrayal dug deeper into me. They weren't just shutting me out socially. They were transferring something that once had my name attached to it, into new hands. And if Denise was carrying those papers into the hall, that meant this wedding was more than a union of love. It was a transaction. I walked farther into the shadows, trying to breathe through the nausea swirling in my stomach. My thoughts swirled between anger and disbelief. Had Quentin known? Had my son, my baby boy, really stood by and let his father erase me from everything we had built together? I wanted to deny it, but I remembered the look in Quentin's eyes in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Cold, distant. He had barely spoken to me, and when he did, it was curt, rehearsed. He had begun answering me the same way his father did, with clipped patience that felt more like dismissal than respect. I had ignored it, telling myself he was stressed about the wedding. But what if it wasn't stress? What if it was complicity? As laughter erupted from inside, I realized with a sinking weight that this day had been designed to humiliate me, not in the way I first feared, with some accident or sudden scene, but with quiet erasure. They wanted me gone, not dead, not missing, but legally and socially invisible. The text that had pulled me away wasn't a curse. It was a gift, a warning from someone who knew I was about to watch my name, my legacy, my motherhood stripped away in the same room where my son promised forever to his bride. I gripped the edge of my clutch until my fingers ached. For years, I had survived Harlan's manipulations in silence, but this was different. This was my son standing beside him, holding the knife as it slid between my ribs. The missing puzzle piece had fallen into place, and the picture it painted was far darker than I had ever imagined. I had always told myself that no matter what happened between Harlan and me, Quentin would never betray me. A husband might turn cold, might stray, might manipulate, but a son was supposed to be tethered to his mother by something stronger than paper, stronger than lies. That belief had kept me breathing through years of silent cruelty. But as I stood outside that hall, the puzzle I had started piecing together revealed a truth I wasn't ready to accept. My child wasn't just a witness. He was a hand holding the pen that signed me away. The confirmation came quietly, almost carelessly, when Denise hurried back outside during the reception. The folder still clutched to her chest. She didn't see me in the shadows. She stepped aside to take a call, her voice low but clear enough in the night air. "Yes, Quentin, yes, I have the paperwork. Don't worry, everything's in motion. She won't know until after today. Your father said this is the cleanest way." My knees nearly buckled. Quentin, my Quentin, the one whose scraped knees I kissed, whose homework I sat up with, whose graduation robe I ironed with tears in my eyes. The same boy who used to press his head to my chest and say I was the only person who ever understood him. Now, he was calmly orchestrating the theft of everything tied to my name. I couldn't stop listening, even though each word stabbed deeper. Yes, the signatures are all lined up. Beneficial interest, the house, even the shares in Ward Holdings. Your father said she's too emotional to manage it anyway. The sooner this is done, the cleaner your marriage starts. There it was, laid out like a knife on a table. They hadn't just forged my signature, they had transferred my life. The home I had made, the investments I had helped nurture in silence, the shares in the company that bore my name, gone, erased. And my son, the one I bore, the one I carried, had been the one to steady the hand as the blade cut. I pressed my back against the wall and let the sting of betrayal swallow me whole. My body shook, not from the cool evening air, but from rage so sharp it tasted metallic on my tongue. I thought of the nights I stayed up when Harlan was working late, waiting for the sound of Quentin's footsteps, waiting to know he was safe. I thought of the meals I skipped so he could have seconds, the little sacrifices I made that no ledger could record. All of it repaid with silence and betrayal. Denise ended the call quickly, and I pulled farther into the shadows before she could notice me. I didn't want her pity. I didn't want her explanations. I didn't want anything except the clarity that had just seared into me. I had no one left inside that building. Not a husband, not a son. For the first time in years, my anger steadied into focus. Betrayal is cruel, yes, but betrayal by blood hardens something inside you that can never be softened again. Quentin's laughter echoed faintly from the hall, and I realized it wasn't the laugh of a groom celebrating his marriage. It was the laugh of a man celebrating a victory over me. In that moment, I stopped being the mother who prayed her son would turn back toward her. I became the woman who would make them both regret underestimating me. They thought they had written me out, shoved me into the margins of my own life. But what they didn't know, what they would soon learn, is that paper can be burned, signatures can be challenged, and trusts can be broken. And hearts can be colder than any contract. I straightened my shoulders, slipped my phone back into my clutch, and walked toward the empty street. For years, I had lived as though silence was survival. But Quentin's betrayal had taught me the truth. Silence wasn't survival. Silence was surrender. And Evelina Ward had never been born to surrender. Harlan was a master at appearances. To the world, he was the picture of stability. Sharp dresser, warm smile, the kind of man people trusted with their money and their secrets. But inside our home, he was something else entirely. He knew how to cut without raising his voice, how to make me question my memory, my sanity, my worth. I remember the first time he called me forgetful in front of Quentin. Quentin was maybe 12 then. I had misplaced the car keys. Ordinary, human, and Harlan laughed, shaking his head, saying, "Your mama's always been scatterbrained. Don't worry, son, your father keeps everything on track." It sounded harmless, even playful, but Quentin laughed too, and I remember the sting of it. That was the seed. And Harlan never stopped watering it. Over the years, the jokes became stories, and the stories became warnings. If I argued about finances, Harlan would tell Quentin I was overreacting. If I questioned a decision, he'd whisper later to our son, "You know how your mother gets emotional, unstable. Don't let her confuse you." He turned every disagreement into an indictment of my character. When Quentin was in college, I tried to guide him toward independence. I told him not to lean too heavily on his father's promises, that he should carve his own path. Harlan twisted that too, telling Quentin I was jealous of his success, that I didn't want him to surpass me. The wedge drove deeper. Quentin started coming home and talking less to me, his words shorter, his eyes clouded with suspicion, as if he were weighing my advice against Harlan's narrative and always finding me wanting. Harlan was clever about timing. He never humiliated me directly in front of Quentin. Instead, he'd plant the doubts in private, then orchestrate situations where I seemed to prove him right. If I forgot an appointment because Harlan conveniently forgot to remind me, he'd use it as proof. If I showed frustration after one of his dismissive remarks, he'd point to it as evidence of my instability. Over time, Quentin stopped defending me and started aligning with him. The most insidious part was how subtle it all seemed. Nothing Harlan did was loud enough to call abuse. It was slow erosion, a wearing down of my place as mother until I was just an accessory in their world, present but powerless. By the time Quentin stood at that altar, his loyalties weren't split. They had been tied neatly with a bow, handed to his father like a gift. The realization sank like stone in my chest. Harlan had been grooming Quentin for this moment all along. The wedding wasn't just about binding Quentin to Maricela. It was about binding him permanently to Harlan's side. And the cost of that bond was me. My erasure was not collateral damage. It was the goal. I stopped at the edge of the lot and looked back at the glowing hall. Through the windows, I could see guests raising glasses, hear laughter spilling into the night, as though the world inside was untouched by the rot crawling beneath it. To them, it was a celebration. To me, it was a coronation. Harlan crowning himself patriarch, with Quentin as his chosen heir, and me discarded like a pawn removed from the board once her usefulness had expired. For years, I had told myself I could survive Harlan by outlasting him. That one day, Quentin would see the truth and stand with me. But Quentin hadn't been stolen from me that night. He had been given away slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to reclaim. That was the moment I understood I wasn't just fighting my husband anymore. I was fighting the shadow of his lies, stitched into the very heart of the boy I had raised. And if I wanted to survive, if I wanted revenge, I would have to dismantle the illusion he built brick by brick, signature by signature, lie by lie. They thought they had prepared for everything. What they hadn't prepared for was the woman they had underestimated finally refusing to stay silent. I didn't go home right away. My body carried me, almost on instinct, to the place I hadn't stepped into in months, the small storage room at the back of my mother's old house. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't grand, just a dusty little room lined with boxes I had promised myself I would organize one day. Instead, I had locked it up and left it as it was, like some museum of a life I thought no one valued but me. I flipped the light on, and the bulb buzzed before spilling its weak glow across the shelves. My hands trembled as I opened the first box. Inside were piles of envelopes, old ledgers, yellowed paper that smelled of ink and time. Most people would have thrown these things away long ago, but I had never been able to. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe sentiment, maybe some quiet voice in me had always known I would need them. As I pulled sheet after sheet into my lap, my eyes adjusted, scanning signatures, Seals Company logos. I saw the original deed to our home, still in my name, untouched by any amendment. I found stock certificates, papers from the early days when Harlan and I built Ward Holdings together, my name typed clearly beside his. I even found trust documents my father had set up in my maiden name, long before I ever met Harlan. Things he never knew existed, things he never thought to erase. Each page felt different now. These weren't just scraps of a past life or keepsakes of a marriage that had crumbled. These were weapons. Every forgotten signature, every notarized stamp was proof that I existed, not just as a wife and mother, but as a rightful owner, a partner, a woman whose presence couldn't be scrubbed away with a forged pen. I remembered how many times Harlan had tried to convince me to declutter. He'd sneer at my habit of keeping boxes of papers. "Why do you hold on to all this junk, Evelina? You don't even understand half of it." I used to shrink under those words, thinking maybe he was right, maybe I was clinging to meaningless scraps. But now I realized why he hated my habit. These weren't meaningless. They were his weakness. My fingers tightened on the stock certificates as I thought back to the laughter of those men outside the wedding hall, the way they had bragged about signatures. They had believed their forgery was airtight because they thought I had no original proof. They thought I had been careless, that I trusted Harlan to keep the records while I stayed ignorant. They didn't know I had my own archive, tucked away in dusty boxes no one cared to open. I spread the papers across the floor like puzzle pieces. My heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something sharper, colder. For the first time since that text had dragged me from the hall, I felt something stir in me that had been dormant for years. Power. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was leverage. Every woman in a marriage like mine learns to hide small things. A little money tucked away, a letter folded inside a Bible, a copy of a birth certificate. I hadn't realized that my quiet hoarding of documents, done in shame, done in secrecy, would one day give me the upper hand. But as I sat there surrounded by proof of my rightful place, I knew Harlan and Quentin hadn't won yet. They had written me out on paper, but I still had the original story. And stories, when told at the right time, can burn empires to the ground. I gathered the most important documents into a single folder, sealing it like a shield. I whispered a promise to myself, to the woman I had been, to the mother they had tried to erase. I will not be invisible. They thought this wedding was the day they crowned themselves kings. But they had forgotten that a queen's power is not in the crown on her head. It's in the records, the receipts, the truths no one else bothered to keep. I stood up from the floor, folder pressed to my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own life. I felt like the storm they never saw coming. The folder of documents pressed against me like armor, but armor alone doesn't win a war. I needed direction, someone who could tell me exactly what I was up against. And that was when the thought returned, the mysterious text that had pulled me out of the wedding in the first place. Someone had wanted me safe. Someone had wanted me to know. It didn't take long to piece it together. That girl I'd seen outside the hall, fumbling her papers, the one with the plain dress and nervous hands. Denise Rowe. I had been introduced to her briefly at the rehearsal dinner, though no one paid her much mind. She wasn't one of Maricella's flashy cousins or one of Harlan's business associates. She was just a title clerk working behind the scenes on real estate transfers and documents nobody cared to read. Nobody except me. The memory of that folder she carried came back sharp, transfer of beneficial interest. It hadn't been meant for my eyes, but she had been carrying the truth the whole time. And I knew then she was the one who had warned me. I didn't call right away. I waited until morning, when the hangovers of celebration would still be fogging the heads of those inside that reception hall, when the world would be quiet enough for secrets to breathe. My hand shook as I dialed the number I found tucked inside one of Quentin's discarded emails, her signature line on a digital file he'd once asked me to forward for him. She answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant, almost guilty. "Mrs. Ward, you sent the text." I didn't phrase it as a question. Silence stretched on the other end, heavy enough to crush the space between us. Finally, she exhaled. "Yes." The knot in my chest tightened. Why? Because I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. I processed signatures all day. "Mrs. Ward." I know the difference between an authentic hand and a traced one. What they did, it was sloppy and it was cruel. They're trying to erase you. And when I saw those papers, I thought you deserved to at least walk out with dignity, not sit there while they announced your disappearance in front of everyone. Her words rattled through me, confirmation of everything I had feared but hadn't dared speak aloud. Harlan and Quentin had planned not just to take my place, but to humiliate me with it. And Denise had stopped it, not by confronting them, but by saving me from the scene. "Do you have copies?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Another pause. "Yes, not official ones, but enough to prove what they did. I've been holding on to them, in case you wanted to fight back." There it was, the opening. A crack in their fortress, small but powerful. "Why risk it?" I asked her. "You don't know me." Her answer was soft, but it struck like iron. "Because I know men like your husband. They think paper is power. They think women don't notice until it's too late. I couldn't let them do it without you knowing. For the first time in years, I felt something close to solidarity. Denise wasn't family. She wasn't a lifelong friend. But in that moment, she was the only one standing on my side of the line. And she had given me exactly what I needed: evidence, proof, leverage. We arranged to meet the next afternoon, far from the eyes of anyone connected to Harlan or Quentin. When we did, she slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were scanned copies of the forged documents, transfers, amendments, even affidavits I supposedly signed. Each one was a blade. Each one was a nail in the coffin they had built for me. But now those nails belonged to me. As I traced the false curves of my name, something hardened inside me. They had spent years grooming my son, convincing him I was weak, unstable, unworthy. They thought they had erased me cleanly, but thanks to Denise, their arrogance had left fingerprints all over the crime. I looked her in the eye, my voice low but certain. They thought they could bury me with paper, but now I'll bury them with the truth. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just a wife or a mother. I was a woman holding a weapon, and with Denise quietly by my side, I knew exactly where to aim. When Denise placed those forged documents in my hands, something inside me shifted. I wasn't a victim anymore, sitting quietly in the shadows while Harlan and Quentin painted me out of existence. I had evidence. I had originals. And for the first time in years, I had a way to strike back. I spent that night at my mother's old house, the floor covered with my folder of originals and Denise's envelope of forgeries. They looked so similar on the surface, but to me, the difference was glaring. One bore my authentic hand, the other a clumsy imitation. My stomach knotted as I realized how close they had come to succeeding. If I hadn't walked out of that wedding, they would have unveiled these transfers as if they were gospel, stripping me bare in front of the world. But I didn't walk back into their trap. I walked into my own. By dawn, I had a plan. I wasn't going to confront them with screaming or tears. That was what Harlan would expect, what he would twist into proof of my instability. No, I was going to fight him on the ground. He worshipped most paper, power, and control. At 9 sharp, I walked into the office of a probate attorney I hadn't spoken to in years, Mr. Alden. He had been a friend of my late father, a man who knew the value of an original signature. When I laid the documents across his desk, his brows knit together, his finger tracing the embossed seals. "These originals predate everything they've tried to move," he murmured, flipping between my folder and the copies Denise had provided. "Mrs. Ward, this isn't just forgery. This is fraud, coercion, elder abuse, all rolled together. They've overplayed their hand." I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. "What can we do?" He tapped the papers into a neat stack. "We file emergency injunctions today. We ask the court to freeze every account, every property transfer, until this is sorted. It will shock them. And if your husband and son are mid-transfer, the banks will lock down everything." The words "freeze everything" echoed like music in my ears. For once, it wouldn't be me paralyzed in fear. It would be them. By noon, Alden had filed the motions. I sat in his office as fax machines and emails churned like soldiers in battle. Letters went to banks, to registries, to brokers. Each one carried the same order: hold, freeze, investigate. I imagined Harlan sitting in his office, smug and untouchable, until his assistant tapped on the door to say the accounts weren't responding, the transfers bouncing back. I imagined Quentin, basking in the afterglow of his wedding night, trying to access funds for the honeymoon, only to be told every line was locked. For years, they had treated me like an afterthought. Now, I was the storm breaking their glass ceiling. The first call came that evening. Harlan's number flashed on my screen, the one I had learned to dread. I let it ring, then it rang again, and again, until finally I picked up, if only to hear the fury. "What have you done, Evelina?" His voice was sharp, guttural, stripped of its practiced charm. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've made?" I let the silence stretch before answering. "No, Harlan, do you?" He cursed, low and bitter. For the first time, he wasn't the man in control. He was scrambling, desperate, furious that I had dared to touch what he thought belonged to him. I hung up without another word. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the rush of power. I had delivered my first strike, and I had landed it squarely. That night, as I sat alone with my folder of papers, I thought of Quentin, my son, my betrayer. I wondered if he was standing beside his father, panicked, demanding answers, or if he was silent, realizing the woman they had underestimated still had teeth. Either way, the message was clear. Evelina Ward was not gone. She was not erased. She was the rightful name on every document, and she had just frozen their empire in place. This was only the beginning. I didn't hear about the fallout directly from Harlan or Quentin. Of course not. They were too proud, too arrogant to admit to me that their fortress had sprung leaks. But news has a way of finding the woman people thought they buried. It started with a call from Denise. Her voice was hushed, but I could hear the excitement hiding beneath it. "Mrs. Ward," she said, "the Brooks family is furious. The bank rejected a transfer this morning. Apparently, they wired part of Maricella's dowry into an account under Ward Holdings, and it got locked in the freeze." I closed my eyes, savoring the picture her words painted. Reginald Brooks, the father of the bride, was a man who valued appearances more than blood. He had paraded his daughter's engagement like a business merger, telling anyone who would listen that the union between the Brooks and the Wards was a guarantee of wealth and influence for decades to come. To hear that his money was now in limbo, trapped in the very accounts he had trusted Harlan to control, it was almost poetic. By that evening, whispers had spread through town. People talked about the scene unfolding behind closed doors at the Brooks estate. Claudia Brooks, Maricella's mother, had raised her glass at the wedding like a queen presenting her heir. Now she was said to be raging in her silk robes, hurling accusations at her new in-laws. "You told us everything was secure. You told us she was out of the picture." I imagined Quentin standing there, his bride at his side, both of them staring down the realization that their golden beginning had been tarnished overnight. What was supposed to be a marriage rooted in security had been exposed as fragile, tangled in litigation, and dependent on a woman they had written off as powerless. The cracks began to spread fast. The Brooks family had invested more than money. They had invested their reputation. Maricella's dowry wasn't just a gift. It was a calculated move to solidify her standing as the wife of a man who would inherit not just a business, but an empire. But with the accounts frozen, the checks bouncing, and the shares under investigation, all that glitter turned to rust. I didn't have to be in the room to know how Reginald's voice would have risen, how his hand would slam against the mahogany table, demanding answers Harlan couldn't give. For years, Harlan had thrived on control. on manipulating every conversation until people bent to his narrative. But control means nothing when the banks themselves say no, when the signatures don't line up, when the courts stamp frozen in black ink. For the first time, I was no longer the target of their humiliation. They were humiliating themselves, unraveling in front of the very allies they had courted to replace me. And it was only the beginning. I sat in my quiet kitchen that night, the folder of originals beside me, a cup of tea untouched at my elbow, and I thought of Maricela. That young woman had smiled at me so sweetly at the rehearsal dinner, calling me Mother Ward like I was already forgotten, already a formality. She thought she was stepping into a dynasty built on power. What she didn't realize was that she had married into rot, and rot spreads quickly. I pictured her face as the reality set in. The gifts they flaunted at the reception couldn't be liquidated. The honeymoon reservations suddenly delayed, her father pacing in anger, her mother pressing sharp words into Quentin's ear. The fracture between families had begun, and no amount of flowers or champagne could cover the stench of distrust. Harlan had spent years teaching Quentin that I was the unstable one, the weak link. Now Quentin's new wife and in-laws would look at him and see the same thing, someone who couldn't control his own house, someone whose promises were as worthless as the forged papers his father had shoved in front of me. The irony was delicious. The very alliance meant to erase me was collapsing under its own weight. And I didn't lift a finger to push it. I had only done one thing, protect what was mine. But protection had turned into a weapon, and now the fallout was spreading further than even I had dared to imagine. The Brooks family had expected to inherit power. Instead, they had inherited chaos. And I intended to make sure every crack turned into a fault line. I didn't need to be in the same house to know what Harlan and Quentin were doing. Men like them are predictable. When they panic, when the walls close in, they scramble not to make amends, not to ask why, but to cover their tracks and claw at whatever they can still hold. And that's exactly what happened once my injunctions landed. It started with little ripples. Denise called me one morning, her voice almost trembling with restrained satisfaction. They tried to move a block of shares into a Cayman account. The system flagged it. The regulators are watching everything now. I let her words settle like honey on my tongue. Offshore. Of course. Harlan always boasted about his contingency plans, about how he was smarter than any judge, any banker. He thought stashing money overseas was a sign of brilliance. But this time, every attempt triggered alarms because of the filings Alden had set in motion. Each transaction was like a flare shot into the night sky, signaling desperation. Quentin wasn't any subtler. He had logged into brokerage accounts from his honeymoon suite, trying to liquidate funds under his own name, as though his youth and fresh marriage could shield him from scrutiny. But the freezes hit him too. Every password typed in, every button clicked, returned the same word in red. Restricted. I pictured him sitting there with Maricela beside him, her manicured fingers clutching his arm, demanding to know why their accounts weren't working, why her father's dowry was locked. The shame of it must have burned hotter than the sun on whatever beach they had tried to escape to. Meanwhile, Harlan was making phone calls. I know his tone when he's cornered. I've heard it too many times. A mix of authority and panic, barking commands as though volume could undo reality. But no matter how many times he tried to sweet talk or threaten the bankers, the regulators had their instructions. Everything tied to my name or forged against it was frozen until further notice. It was almost funny. For years, Harlan had called me paranoid when I insisted on keeping originals of our papers. "You're living in the past, Evelina. You don't trust anyone," he'd sneer. And yet here I was, using those very papers to choke the life out of the empire he had tried to steal. The beauty of it was in the timing. I hadn't rushed to file. I had waited until the wedding was over, until their arrogance was at its peak, until they were certain they had already won. My filings hit like a storm at dawn, just when they thought the sky was clear. Every desperate move they made now only drew more attention, painted them more clearly as men trying to hide something. I sat in my quiet kitchen with my tea, my folder of originals still spread across the table like trophies. The phone buzzed with updates from Alden and Denise, new transfers attempted, new failures logged, new eyes turning toward Harlan and Quentin's dealings. I didn't need to raise my voice. The paper was speaking for me. By the end of the week, the whispers had become open gossip. Business partners were pulling away. The Brooks family had stopped defending them, too humiliated to tie their name further to chaos. Neighbors who once nodded politely now looked at them with narrowed eyes. And through it all, I remained silent. Silent, but deliberate. Harlan and Quentin thought they could erase me with forged ink. Instead, it was their signatures, fake, frantic, and flagged, that betrayed them. They had written their own undoing, and all I had done was shine a light on the paper. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it all wash over me. They were desperate, frantic, trying to outrun consequences. But the beauty of desperation is that it leaves footprints everywhere. And I was watching, patient, ready to follow every mark until there was nothing left for them to run with. The mother they had underestimated wasn't gone. She was right here, tightening the noose with every document they thought they had buried. I knew it wouldn't take long before Harlan tried to reassert control. Men like him thrive on appearances. And when the whispers began about the frozen accounts, the stalled transfers, the Brooks family's outrage, he couldn't sit still. He needed to reclaim his image, to convince the world that the Wards were unshaken. So, when the invitations arrived for a family dinner at a private hall downtown, I wasn't surprised. They dressed it up as a casual gathering, but I knew better. This was Harlan's attempt to gather allies, to reassure Maricella's parents, to convince Quentin's circle of friends that everything was fine. It was a performance, and I was supposed to be the missing piece, the absent mother they had quietly erased. But this time, I didn't slip away quietly. I arrived early, folder tucked under my arm, my chin lifted higher than it had been in years. Eyes followed me as I entered, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Some hadn't expected to see me at all. Others whispered, as if my very presence was scandal. And there, at the center of it all, sat Harlan and Quentin, their smiles stretched too thin, their suits a little too crisp. Quentin's eyes flickered when he saw me. For a moment, I saw the boy I raised, the boy who used to light up when I entered a room. But the flicker died quickly, replaced by the cold stare Harlan had perfected. He gave me nothing but a tight nod, as if I were a guest instead of his mother. Dinner began with pleasantries, with Claudia Brooks commenting loudly about how rumors get so easily twisted. Reginald sat stiff beside her, his jaw clenched, clearly waiting for someone, anyone, to explain where his money had gone. Harlan poured wine, charming, weaving his voice like silk over broken glass. Quentin added a few reassurances, parroting words I recognized as his father's. It might have worked if I hadn't stood up. I let them finish their empty performance before rising slowly, placing my folder on the table with deliberate care. Conversations died. Instantly, forks paused midair. All eyes turned toward me. I didn't plan to speak tonight. I began, my voice steady, each word measured. But since we are all here to clear the air, perhaps the truth deserves a seat at this table. Harlan stiffened, his smile faltering for the first time. Quentin's hand tightened around his glass. I opened the folder and spread the first document across the table, the original deed to our home. My name sat clearly beside Harlan's, stamped and notarized decades ago. This, I said, tapping the paper, is my signature, my rightful ownership, the original. Then, with deliberate precision, I laid Denise's copy beside it, the forged transfer, bearing my name in shaky lines that mimicked but did not match. Gasps rippled through the room. Claudia leaned forward, squinting, her lips curling as she compared the two. This is what they tried to use. I continued, my eyes sweeping across the table. A forgery, a manipulation, an erasure. I pulled out more. Stock certificates, trust papers, affidavits, all with my name written cleanly on the originals and laughably on the forgeries. I didn't need to shout. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation. Harlan's face darkened, the mask slipping. Evelina, you're twisting this. No, I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to slice through his lie. For years you've twisted everything. You told our son I was unstable. You told our friends I was emotional. You told this family I was irrelevant. But paper doesn't lie. Harlan. And tonight, everyone at this table can see exactly who the liar is. Quentin's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His silence was as damning as the paper spread before us. Reginald Brooks leaned back, his expression stony, his hand curling into a fist. Claudia hissed under her breath, glaring at Quentin as though she had been betrayed personally. The alliance they had built was crumbling in real time, shattered by the evidence in front of them. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like the one being watched, judged, or diminished. I felt like the one holding the knife, finally cutting through years of lies. I gathered the papers back into my folder, my voice calm but final. You tried to erase me. Instead, you erased yourselves. And this, I lifted the folder slightly, is only the beginning. The silence that followed was thick, humiliating, undeniable. The great Harlan Ward had been unmasked. Quentin, his chosen heir, sat exposed as complicit. And I, the woman they thought would leave quietly, had delivered their humiliation in front of the very people they had sought to impress. I left the table without waiting for dessert. I didn't need sweetness. I had already tasted victory. I didn't have to lift another finger after that dinner. Once the papers were shown, once the forgeries were exposed in front of people who mattered, the machine began to turn on its own. Harlan had spent years building an empire on arrogance and manipulation, but arrogance leaves cracks and manipulation leaves trails. And when trails are lit, regulators always follow. It began with letters, thick envelopes stamped with state seals delivered to Harlan's office. Denise called me the morning she processed one. It's starting, she said. The auditors are pulling his filings. Every transfer, every amendment, every single paper, he thought no one would ever question. I imagined his face when the first notice landed on his desk, the red-stamped words demanding explanations. For years, he had been the one controlling paper, signing, shifting, forging as he pleased. Now those same papers were evidence, turned against him. Soon after, the phone calls began. Not from him, but from others. An investigator wanted to confirm details on my signature. A compliance officer needed my testimony about when I last reviewed certain accounts. A civil clerk scheduled me for deposition. Every call felt like another brick in the wall closing in around him. And then there was the word that cut sharper than any other, elder abuse. When Alden explained it, I sat silent for a moment, the weight of it settling over me. They used your age and trust against you, he said, convincing you to sign papers you didn't understand or forging your signature outright. It falls directly under elder abuse statutes. I almost laughed, though it came out more like a choke. Harlan had always prided himself on calling me old-fashioned, mocking me for keeping records, for being cautious, for clinging to the past. Now, that very insult had teeth. He hadn't just wronged me, he had committed a crime defined by law. And the law was circling him now, not me. The police inquiry was slower, but inevitable. Forgery isn't just a civil problem. It's criminal. I heard from Denise that subpoenas were being served, that clerks whispered about investigators visiting the registry. I pictured Harlan's smooth smile stiffening when asked to explain documents signed in my name while I was hundreds of miles away on the dates they claimed. Quinton wasn't spared either. The regulators didn't care about his age or his honeymoon. He was listed as a co-beneficiary, as someone who had co-signed on transfers. His name sat beside his father's in black ink, making him just as guilty in their eyes. Depositions were scheduled for him, too. I almost pitied him, but pity doesn't survive betrayal. He had chosen his side. I didn't dance in celebration, not outwardly. I stayed quiet, steady, patient. That's the thing about revenge. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, smiling faintly, while others crumble under the weight of their own lies. Word spread quickly, as it always does. Neighbors who once nodded politely at Harlan began to whisper instead. Former associates avoided his calls. Even Claudia Brooks, so loud and certain at the wedding, was seen entering her car with her head bowed, avoiding eye contact. The alliance they had forged was dissolving under the heat of legal scrutiny. For years, they had painted me as unstable, emotional, fragile. And yet there I was, calm and collected, speaking only when necessary to investigators, producing originals without fuss, answering questions with clarity. Every time I handed over another document, every time I swore under oath, I felt the scales tipping further in my favor. The irony wasn't lost on me. Harlan had always believed control lived in his hands. But now control was in the hands of strangers with badges, of auditors with calculators, of clerks with stamps. And I had placed it there. At night, alone in my quiet house, I let myself feel the smallest sliver of satisfaction. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't thrown a scene. I had simply done what he never expected. I had fought with patience, with proof, with the kind of quiet strength that can't be erased. The investigators weren't finished. The worst was still to come. But for the first time in years, I knew the truth was no longer mine alone to bear. It was out in the open now, written into official records, forcing men like Harlan and Quentin to answer for the lives they had tried to steal. And I intended to watch every second of their fall. It didn't surprise me that the investigations rattled Harlan. He'd spent his whole life balancing lies like plates in the air, and now the regulators were knocking them down one by one. But what I didn't expect, at least not so quickly, was how fast Quentin's marriage would begin to unravel. Maricela had walked down that aisle as if she were ascending a throne. Her gown wasn't just a dress. It was armor stitched in lace, a statement to everyone that she had chosen well, that she was now the wife of a man destined for wealth and stature. Her family smiles at the reception had been smug, proud, certain they had sealed a deal as valuable as any contract. But marriages built on paper promises crumble the fastest. I heard about the first cracks through whispers in town. The Brooks family had been blindsided by the frozen accounts. Reginald's money meant to secure their daughter's future, was trapped, tangled in investigations he couldn't untangle. And Claudia, the proud matriarch, had been humiliated in front of her own friends. It didn't take long before Maricela's smiles turned brittle. Within weeks, she was spotted in public without her wedding ring. She no longer clung to Quentin's arm at social events, no longer played the role of the glowing newlywed. Instead, her face was tight, her words sharp, her laughter non-existent. I wasn't there for their private arguments, but I didn't need to be. I had lived through years of Harlan's manipulations. I knew the script. Claudia would have pressed her daughter, demanding to know why she had married into a family collapsing under investigation. Reginald would have asked about the missing money, about the shame of attaching their name to scandal. And Maricela, young, ambitious, still craving her parents' approval, would have turned to Quentin, demanding answers he couldn't give. Because what could he say? That he had trusted his father's forgeries? That he had believed erasing his own mother would secure him a throne? That the empire he had promised her was built on lies and theft? No explanation could sweeten that truth. One afternoon, Denise called me with a trace of awe in her voice. She moved back to her parents' house. She said, less than a month after the wedding. The papers haven't been filed yet, but everyone knows it's over. I sat in silence for a long time after that, not because I was surprised, but because there was something almost poetic in it. The marriage that was supposed to seal my erasure had collapsed faster than a paper crown in the rain. The alliance that was meant to replace me had cracked apart before it could even harden. Quentin must have been reeling. The son who had chosen his father's lies over his mother's truth now stood abandoned by the very woman he thought would elevate him. I imagined him pacing in the empty marital home, his voice rising, his hands gripping his head in frustration as Maricela packed her things. And I imagined Harlan standing nearby, silent for once, unable to spin the failure into anything but what it was, disgrace. But I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with his father in betraying me. He hadn't just hurt me. He had tried to erase me, and now the consequence of that choice was his own erasure, his own humiliation, his own loss. Maricela's departure sent ripples through the community. People who had once toasted the perfect union now whispered about its collapse, shaking their heads at the speed of it all. The Brooks family stopped answering Harlan's calls, distancing themselves from the wards as if the scandal were contagious. And Quentin, he was left with nothing but ashes. I didn't lift a hand to ruin his marriage. I didn't whisper a word. All I had done was protect what was mine. The rest collapsed under the weight of their own greed, their own arrogance. As I folded the news articles Denise forwarded me, I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It wasn't peace either. It was something colder, sharper, more enduring. Vindication. They had tried to strip me of my identity, my family, my place. Instead, they had stripped themselves of everything that gave them power. And now Quentin's perfect marriage, the crown jewel of their betrayal, was shattered, left in pieces for the whole world to see. And I wasn't done yet. By the time winter crept in, the men who once thought themselves untouchable were cornered. Harlan, the great strategist, the man who boasted about never losing a deal, now stood on the edge of financial ruin with his son beside him. And it wasn't because of some rival businessman or economic downturn. It was because of me, the woman they thought they could write out of the picture. The regulators had done their work. Bank accounts stayed frozen. Assets once thought secure. Properties, shares, trusts, all tied up under injunctions. Every desperate transfer Quentin attempted only pulled more scrutiny. Every excuse Harlan offered in depositions sounded hollower than the last. Their arrogance, once their armor, had become evidence of fraud. Soon the lawsuits came. Partners who had once praised Harlan now filed claims, seeking damages for deals built on forged documents. Investors demanded their money back. Even distant relatives who had been promised inheritances lined up, eager to distance themselves by tearing what was left of the Ward name apart in court. And then came the notices that hit hardest of all, bankruptcy filings. I saw the papers myself, public records, stamped in black ink, Harlan Ward and Quentin Ward, both forced to declare bankruptcy to shield what little they had left from complete seizure. The same men who had conspired to erase me on paper were now erasing themselves with the single most humiliating filing imaginable. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't laugh either. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, the same place where I had once shrunk under Harlan's words, and I let the silence tell me everything I needed to know. I had won. Their reputations were shattered. The Brooks family, already pulling away after Maricella's departure, cut the cord completely. Reginald publicly distanced his company from Ward Holdings, calling the marriage a mistake of trust. Claudia was seen in tears at a luncheon, humiliated that her daughter had been dragged into such scandal. Quentin was no longer a newlywed darling. He was a liability, a stain on their name. I imagined him sitting alone, papers spread before him, realizing that the empire he thought would be his was gone. The home he planned to raise children in ceased. The accounts meant for his future, frozen. The marriage meant to elevate him, broken. And standing behind him, Harlan, silent and bitter, unable to spin this loss into anything but what it was, failure. Bankruptcy is more than numbers. It is humiliation made permanent, a record etched into law that says you could not handle what you claim to own. For a man like Harlan, whose entire identity was control, it was worse than prison. It was exposure. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to gloat. The system was doing it for me. Every letter they received, every meeting with lawyers, every headline about their collapse was another nail sealing the coffin of their pride. And I thought back to that text on my son's wedding day. Leave quietly. Don't tell your son or husband. They thought they had forced me out to save their performance. They thought my absence would make me invisible. Instead, that absence became my strength. By leaving quietly, I had returned louder than they could bear. Now it was them being erased, bank accounts closed, assets seized, reputations destroyed. The men who had tried to silence me were scrambling for scraps, begging courts for mercy. And me, I sat in calm, deliberate silence, my folder of originals untouched on the table. I didn't need to use another page. I had already won the war, but there was one more step to take. Revenge is never complete until the legacy is secured. And I was ready to write the final chapter myself. When the filings of bankruptcy became official, I knew the time had come to make my last move. Revenge is never just about watching someone fall. It's about ensuring they can never rise again at your expense. For me, that meant taking the very thing they had tried to strip from me, our estate, our name, our future, and locking it away where their hands could never reach it. I returned once more to the folder of originals, the stack of papers that had been my shield and sword. Nestled within it was something I had almost forgotten, a trust deed my father created years before I married Harlan, one that bore my maiden name. At the time, I had thought little of it. It was a relic, a technicality, a document tied to old family property. But now I saw it for what it was, a loophole, a legal bridge that could move everything back into my control. Mr. Alden, my attorney, nearly smiled when I laid it on his desk. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is your clean slate. Because it predates your marriage, you can revive it. We can use it as the anchor for a new trust that carries your name alone. And once the proceeds from their collapsed assets are liquidated, we'll move them here." The words settled into me like peace after a storm. A trust in my name, built on foundations they could not touch. The perfect irony. They had tried to erase me with false signatures, and now my authentic signature would be the only one that mattered. It wasn't simple. Paperwork never is. Weeks passed as Alden filed the revival documents, as the courts approved the restructuring, as the final seizures from Harlan and Quinton's accounts were transferred. Each day I watched the dominoes fall, properties auctioned, shares dissolved, partnerships dissolved in bitter silence. And each day, a portion of it was routed directly into the trust that bore my name. When it was complete, I sat in Alden's office and signed the final page. My hand didn't shake. My pen didn't pause. The trust was sealed. And then came the decision that mattered most. I want it all secured for my grandchildren. I told him, not for Harlan, not for Quinton, not for their lies, for the next generation. They'll grow up knowing their legacy came from me, not from the men who tried to erase me. He nodded, his eyes almost shining with something that looked like respect. "Then, that's what we'll do." And so the final stroke of my revenge wasn't a public humiliation, not a courtroom battle, not a shouting match across a dinner table. It was quiet, deliberate, irrevocable. I placed everything that mattered into a secure fund for the children yet to come, the ones who would bear the Ward name but not its corruption. When the documents were filed, I walked out of that office lighter than I had felt in years. I knew Harlan and Quinton would hear soon enough that the estate they tried to steal had been rerouted beyond their reach, that the woman they called unstable had been the one to steady the future. They would hear, and they would rage. But rage means nothing when the paper is sealed. At night, sitting alone in my living room, I thought of Quentin as a boy, his laugh, his small hands clutching mine, the way he used to look at me with trust before Harlan poisoned it. I mourned the child he had been, but I did not regret what I had done to the man he had become. Betrayal has consequences, and I had delivered them cleanly. The secured trust wasn't just about money. It was about legacy. It was about making sure that when people spoke the Ward name in years to come, they wouldn't think of Harlan's arrogance or Quentin's betrayal. They would think of me, Evelina Ward, the woman who refused to be erased. And with the ink dry, my revenge was nearly complete. Only one thing remained, the final word. Revenge isn't fire. It isn't the screaming or the smashing of plates or the shouting that echoes until your voice breaks. I learned that in the quiet hours after the filings, after the hearings, after the humiliations played themselves out in public, real revenge is patience. It's paper. It's foresight. It's refusing to break when everyone expects you to. I look back now at how it began, sitting in that wedding hall, waiting to watch my son begin his new life, believing for a brief moment that maybe, despite everything, I still had a place in his story. And then my phone vibrated. Just a single line of text that changed everything. Leave quietly. Don't tell your son or husband. I obeyed. Confused, shaken, but obedient. And because I obeyed, I didn't sit in that room while they tried to erase me. I didn't let them strip me in front of everyone. Instead, I stepped outside, and in stepping out, I found the truth. Their plan was never about building a future. It was about burying me. But they failed. Harlan lost the empire he built on lies. Quentin lost the marriage he thought would crown him king. Together, they lost every scrap of dignity they had clung to, standing in courtrooms and offices with their reputations in tatters, their accounts empty, their names stained. And I walked forward with my head high, my documents intact, my legacy secured. I did not destroy them with rage. Rage burns too fast. I destroyed them with patience, with the foresight to hold on to what they thought was worthless, with the quiet strength to wait until their arrogance exposed them. Every forged signature, every false smile, every whispered manipulation, it all collapsed under the weight of truth they thought would never surface. And now, when I look at the trust in my name, when I see the future sealed for grandchildren who will one day ask about the Ward legacy, I know what they'll hear. Not Harlan's charm, not Quentin's betrayal. They'll hear about the woman who refused to vanish, the mother who turned humiliation into power, the wife they thought was unstable who instead proved unshakable. This was never about screaming or clawing back what was mine. It was about ensuring that when the ledger closed, it balanced in my favor. And it did. And when the dust cleared, I was still standing. Evelina Ward, mother, survivor, the last word that neither husband nor son could erase.